likely to have progress in Palestine because the political environment is changing, and it's changing for the good. The problem is here, and the question of this debate isn't whether we're going to have absolute perfect solution to the Palestinian-Israeli problem. It's whether or not the UN membership will make this better, or whether it will entrench the attitudes that have led to the problem being a problem in the first place. What we told you is that fundamentally, what you're entering into is a highly politicized organization that, for a raft of reasons that government, that opposition has given you, isn't likely to have decisive decisions that can actually make a difference on organizations. In order for the UN to be effective in this situation, you need to have political will within the organization, and you need to have some kind of capacity to enforce the decisions you actually make. We told you that US support and entrenched US support that isn't likely to change, and that the political conditions that make that US support have not changed is likely to continue and block any meaningful resolutions. But even if there were meaningful resolutions made about this issue, US and Israel simply have no incentive to implement these. There already is very weak buy-in to the UN as an organization and to many of the other organizations like the ICC. There's simply no reason to expect that all of a sudden this buy-in will change when you start forcing decisive issues on the countries that are not willing to accept them. You'll simply have less buy-in to the organizations that you fundamentally believe are important to have this. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen today is that there has been no substantial reason why the UN is able to make a real substantive change. Therefore, what we need to consider is how this will really change the negotiating position between the two, between Israel and Palestine, and how having a statehood will change the fundamentals of what we're trying to do right now. What we told you is there's also, similarly within this, it's also not going to change this idea that somehow having UN membership is going to create prosperity. Firstly, because the fundamental reason that you don't have prosperity in the Palestinian Authority is because of the warlike state in which they live in. And we think that you can have an agreement in the World Trade Organization, but it won't make a difference if you're still being blockaded by an Israel that is unwilling to compromise. Secondly, what we tell you is even if that wasn't true, Palestine just don't have the capacity to engage in these meaningful abstract organizations that require substantial capacity, and we just don't think this prosperity issue is really a big issue in this debate. What we then need to talk about is what's going to really be more likely to have compromise. And Ashish here wanted to stand up and tell us that we should ignore Israel's wishes, but fundamentally we need to care about what both organizations and both sides of this debate have in order to create buy-in. And what closing opposition are going to give you is show you why you're going to have less likely to have meaningful Palestinian negotiation and debate in negotiations, less likely to have meaningful Israeli ability to negotiate, and have weaker UN buy-in and UN process in the long run. So what are we going to tell you? First of all, let's look at why exactly this is going to harm Palestine's ability to negotiate. No, thank you. But what we heard today is that we needed some kind of negotiation between Fatah and Hamas as a first kind of building block in order to have real change in Palestine. What we tell you, though, is contrary to what closing government would have us believe, this actually requires compromise in two directions. We see right now that Hamas is the overwhelmingly powerful force in Palestine, not Fatah. And fundamentally, if we want to have a unified Palestinian Authority, you need Fatah to also be willing to compromise. The problem is, if they enter into the UN system, they are entrenched in such a way that they will find it more difficult to compromise for three key reasons. First of all, because their legitimacy is built on following the values of the UN, and those values of the UN fundamentally oppose the things that Hamas believes in, like failing to believe that Israel is a state, for example, they can't compromise in any way in order to actually meet Hamas in the middle. That means you're less likely to have that because their legitimacy is derived from things that are fundamentally opposed to Hamas. Secondly, what we tell you is that they're beholden to foreign powers who give them their power by allowing them to have UN legitimacy, and since foreign powers tend to oppose Hamas, they can't buckle on that either. And third, what we tell you is that because they're using the UN as some kind of mechanism of organization and mechanism of discussion, and Hamas isn't recognized by the UN, you're going to be less likely for them to be able to use the mechanism and power they have. Overall, what this means is that you have less negotiation between Fatah and Hamas because Fatah is no longer willing to compromise and to meet Hamas in the middle. We would like to have Fatah be the sole power, and we'd like to have a liberal power in the Palestinian Authority, but fundamentally what's first and more important is to have a unified power that is capable of negotiating legitimately for the people of Palestine to make real change, and that's not what you get under their model. Secondly, what we tell you is that this policy of involvement in the UN works both ways, because all of a sudden not only is Palestine, for example, empowered to take Israel to court, Israel is empowered to charge Palestine with the crimes that it sees as being committed against it. We say fundamentally, this is not a good thing despite Ashish's clapping on the desk, because what it means is that Israel is more able to defend itself in the way that it has so far. Israel's primary reaction, I'll take in a moment, Ashish, to forces, to pressure to negotiate, has been to say that Palestine is an illegitimate organization that is directly hurting and bombing Israel. They are now more able to say this because all of a sudden this is not a state that is unable to control its people. It's a UN-recognized state, and therefore it has the obligation to stop types of attacks coming from them. These types of attacks all of a sudden have greater legitimacy, and Israel is better able to defend itself, firstly in the eyes of its people, and secondly in the international community. Go, Ashish.
We told you in opening that there are two factions in Hamas, one led by Khalid Meshal that supports Fatah and wants unification, and one led by Haniyeh. This is a policy that empowers that moderate faction, and it's precisely what allows for Israel to unify the governments, and this has happened in your
Okay, I think Ashish has missed the point here that we're actually talking about whether Fatah will be willing to compromise with Hamas, but more importantly, that's simply not true. Hamas's ability to get legitimacy from the people of Palestine is fundamentally driven by their opposition to Israel. Both of these sides, and particularly the more hardline side, draws more legitimacy because they're more opposed to Israel. It's simply untrue that this will change this dynamic, considering that's the fundamental of what gives them power in the first place. But let's move on to why Israel is less likely to engage. They're less likely to engage for three key reasons. First of all, because you'll empower hardliners within Israel, particularly Israel and the Jewish homeland, who see this as the greatest affront that could be made to them, and who see themselves as on the back foot to Palestine in the first place, and will be greater empowered, as has been the trend over the last 10 years, that have seen negotiations collapse. Secondly, it also empowers forces in America, which are as important a negotiating factor here, particularly hardline Republicans and hardline Jewish lobbyists, who will again be involved in opposing this, and make them less likely to buy into compromise this down. What we'd also tell you is that it means that negotiated concessions become a lot more difficult because they come admissions of guilt, and admissions of guilt now have greater value. Because you can get punished by the court system and by the UN system if we are to believe a proposition. It means that every time Israel has a concession and they say we should give up this land, they also say we should be punished in the UN mechanism and we should be punished in this system. That makes every single concession that they have to make more expensive and more difficult for the people of Israel, makes them less likely to concede. Third, what we tell you is that it stops them from getting involved because all of a sudden it puts the structures of negotiations in an organization that is fundamentally against Israel, and because they won't believe that they'll ever be able to get progress in a UN which fundamentally opposes them, they won't become involved in that. Fourth, and lastly, what we tell you is that this simply destroys the legitimacy of the UN in the process of Palestinian negotiation. Because you may have statehood, and you may be a part of the organization, but unless that organization is actually able to make a difference, the Palestinian people are simply going to get frustrated and angry every time they try and do something in the UN and America and Israel blocks them. That simply builds into the perception of the UN as an American pawn that isn't in the interests of Palestine, and that breaks down any legitimacy you may have for this organization in the future. Basically, under their model, nothing changes in terms of real resolutions because that isn't able to make a difference. What changes is that Palestine is less able to negotiate, Israel is less able to negotiate, and you break down the legitimacy of this organization in the future. We must not allow this to happen. Thank you.